With Aaron, where do you start? He is one of the primary experts in the UK on the emergence of the far right, not just in the UK, but also in Europe and further afield as well. Aaron works in the Lancaster University. He's a senior lecturer there. He's also a research associate at the University of Witwatersrand, in South Africa. He is co-editor of Historical Perspectives on Organised Crime and Terrorism, and he also co-edited a book on researching the far right with lots of great information for people from different theoretical perspectives on how to research the far right. He also wrote a very well-received book with Aurélien Mondon at the University of Bath called Reactionary Democracy: How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. That book was how I heard of Aaron in the first place. He's published widely in academic and non-academic contexts. He's co-editor of Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power in the Manchester University Press series, Racism, Resistance and Social Change. He's a trustee of the Runnymede Trust, which is a fantastic civil society, a funder in the United Kingdom, and of the Sociological Review Foundation, and on the convening committee of Reactionary Politics Research Network, and on the and the editorial board of Ethnic and Racial Studies. And I'm sure that's only a part of all the fantastic work that Aaron does. So I'm going to hand over to Aaron now. And if you get your, I've got your here.
I got this just in case. It's right.
Okay.
That's likely to smell.
Extra one, just in case.
Do I need to do anything, or is it already on? I'll put it on, but is it?
It's on.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Do you want that? It's a clicker.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm going to do it on the face. I don't have my glasses. There. All right?
Okay. Oh no, I accidentally did the fading thing, which I didn't intend to do.
Yeah. Is it too late to change it?
Yeah, probably. It may talk faster than me, or I may talk faster than it. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I would like to start, or I intended to start, with a little discussion about the situation in Ireland, but Barry covered most of the things, actually more than the things I was going to mention. Is also more of an expert than I am. But I just want to highlight, in addition to what Barry laid out, that the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism Ireland report identified a rise in far-right parties or candidates, active far-right and extremist groups, largely focused on anti-immigrant and anti-LGBTQ+ agendas and the intersection between them, something we're finding globally, as well as violence, arson attacks, assaults, riots, including incidents targeting alleged migrant accommodation sites, which are on the rise, and something we've seen in England as well. And the report highlights how images of unrest, as well as related memes and other information and images, have crossed globally and have become a form of sort of currency, if you will. Much like in a previous era, images of South Africa had been, as a sort of a front line of anti-immigrant resistance. We had for a moment seen something similar in England, but largely the global far right has decided England is a no-go zone for white people, and it has already been given up. I say this in a sort of, I find that very odd, and I'm often interviewed about this issue and have to explain how, as a white person and a Jewish person, I wander around England quite freely. Because you'd think from a lot of far right as well as mainstream right media, this is an impossibility. I tend not to see myself as an exception. So we've also seen Irish far-right figures, including National Party members and former Deputy Leader James Reynolds, join other far-right leaders recently in Portugal at the Remigration Summit, that was also attended by Greg Bravino, if anyone remembers from this sort of very overtly fascist images of the head of ICE. Turns out it wasn't just a fashion thing that people were making fun of. He's literally a fascist. There was also, as noted, the killing of Yves Sekila in Dublin, causing outrage, accusations of racism, and calls for a racial reckoning, partly because, not only because of his identity, but because of the lack of recognition of racism being a factor. But we also know, aside from sort of violent incidents, which have often been used as a proxy for racism, and I mean this analytically, not kind of like morally or anything like this, but have been used often by the mainstream to distract from the systemic, structural, and institutional racism that underpins violence, that is far more widespread, and is often deployed in the failure to recognize racism or combat it. This includes institutional racism in government and in policing, healthcare, as well as employment, as Dr. Ibrahim Joseph has argued that racism is rampant in Ireland across all sectors and levels, highlighting in the case of the article I'm referring to, employment. She said, I think we should come to a place that we can all agree there is racism in Ireland. People think racism is only in America, but it's happening here. There are also Bertie Ahern's comments, which were widely condemned, but there's an analysis, a thread of analysis that says he was only saying what the people demanded, or the people wanted to hear. Now, my argument has largely been, if you can say racist things and attribute them, blame them on other people, you're being racist. I don't have any problem sort of saying that. I say, I tend not to say you are a racist, because I'm not talking about the person in all the sort of debatable characteristics in history, because you get into a rabbit hole. But you also saw affirmations of what he said from Steenson, who was already mentioned, and other sort of far-right figures who are rising in the polls. And I really want to kind of highlight that idea of what the people need, want, or demand, because I'm going to come back to it. This is all something we're seeing in the UK, US, across Europe, which my research on the mainstreaming of the far right and liberal exceptionalism have been focused on. And it's in that capacity I'm part of this project. I have skills. PowerPoint and remembering to change slides is not one of them. That's why I'm part of the project on liberalism's shadow. And it's a project that, as Barry noted, and anyone who's familiar with it, challenges Irish exceptionalism. It also challenges another form of exceptionalism, the idea that the far right and racism are exceptional and outliers in normally tolerant, post-racial, post-war, liberal democratic settlements. It also challenges the mainstreaming thesis that treats racism in the far right as an exception which threatens our otherwise perfect liberal democracies. And in that case, it challenges liberalism as well. It also challenges one thing I really want to highlight here, which I'm not going to go into in great deal, but it's something I've written about and argued about a lot in recent years. It foregrounds and interviews and engages with people who are on the sharp end of racist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-migrant racism and hate. And too much research on the far right focuses on and centers the grievances of the perpetrators. It's why I've seen panels where you end up having a panel of all white, all cis, often male academics and third sector representatives, and former white supremacists tell us all what racism is, how it operates, how it is experienced as a terrible, terrible burden on racists. And it's good to see that there is an expansion of that in projects where you talk to communities activists, organizations which represent communities at the sharp end, and individuals. So it's great to be involved in the project. Now, I've been working on the far right for 25 years. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of changes. My focus of my research has been mostly the UK, the US, Canada, a bit of Australia, and France. And this can largely be put down to my interests, but also my limitation of language. And we have seen the far right increasingly mainstreamed and emboldened globally over the past number of years. And what I'm trying to illustrate by this is concerns about terrorism, concerns about radicalization, concerns about riots, hate crime, violence, but also the actions, sort of articulations, iterations, and ideologies and interests of mainstream actors, including Keir Starmer, who, as the great bulwark against the far right, has been echoing Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, in which he's simultaneously celebrated by the far right for finally getting it right and condemned as a socialist or communist, which is, Schrodinger's kind of politician. Now, in response to this rise, there's been a groundswell of political media and academic interest and analysis that has been dominated by a normative, system-supportive, problem-solving, counter-extremism and counter-terrorism approach or framework. Treating the far right as an outlier, an exception, treating racism as manifesting in and embodied by the worst, most violent actors, often individuals, but also organizations and sort of subcultures. Racism and the far right are seen as a threat to democracy and rarely treated as part of the mainstream society or associated with wider structural, systemic, social issues or inequalities. And where they are, it's often, as I will expand on, is attributable to class inequality and attributed to the working class, as if class inequality disproportionately affects white people and white working class people are disproportionately racist and potentially extremist. Now, at the same time, political scientists, as well as politicians and media, often represent the far right as an expression of the legitimate concerns of the white working class. Sometimes they say the working class. Sometimes they say the demos or the people. They see it as people who are left behind and whose experience of class inequality is one of, and deprivation, is also one of competition, unfair competition from newcomers, or as those who are beneficiaries of affirmative action or positive discrimination or reverse racism, they will call it. And that they demand and deserve democratic representation, or they will turn to violence, which is far worse. I will unpack that. Now, one of the interesting things is, as I will also speak to, is the way in which class inequality seems to always manifest in flags, cultural symbols, and identity by people who claim those who are claiming racism are just playing identity politics and just using virtue signaling and symbolism. And I live in an area that was widely affected by the, I work in Lancaster, I live in London, and I was widely affected by the sort of raise the colors. And I remember talking to a politician who came by my door, and I was doing some media work, and people were going, but why would you come to this country and not expect to see flags? And I'm like, no, but it's a fair enough question. Like when I arrive at an airport, I go to a government building, maybe a school, not on my zebra crossing and my neighbor's newsagent store with an offensive word, get out, underneath it. I mean, maybe I'm being picky, but I want to start by a stark example that I think says a lot about where we are or where we've been in England, but also analytically and politically more broadly. And it is one that demonstrates or illustrates that sort of binary between exceptionalizing the far right as this outlier threat and democratizing it, saying we need to represent it. And that's my sort of two themes here, will be exceptionalization and democratization. And this is the summer of 2024, the far right riots that spread across England, as well as Northern Ireland and Wales. They followed, as many of you will know, the murder of 3 young girls in Southport on 29th of July, an attack falsely attributed to a Muslim asylum seeker. Now, there were 2 dominant responses. The first one was to individualize, exceptionalize, and pathologize and criminalize some of these actors. It was labeled, sorry, I just lost control of that one. Do you know how I go back? Sorry.
There's 2 arrows, so the arrow.
Yeah, I got it.
Go back, yeah.
See, now you know all the giveaways. You saw the ending. So you see, rule of the mob. Mobs, yobs, thugs, using very classist language. I thought thugs was particularly inappropriate. It was widely attributed to misinformation, disinformation, and radicalization online. I always find that interesting because I do a lot of sessions on misinformation, disinformation, and people will say to me going like, yes, but you have to admit it's a lot of misinformation, that the perpetrator was not a Muslim asylum seeker. I go, well, if he had been, it would have been fine. And I think that's where that argument goes in the end, because that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter who he is. In the same way, I would argue, it doesn't matter that Henry Novak is white. There's a serious problem with police procedure, training, suspicion, and brutality that actually is disproportionately affecting racialized and minoritized and migratized people. We often see the far right really jumps at the individual case, which is also why individualization is not a good analytical tool, to make it really banal and methodological. So it made these riots about nothing structural, systemic, or mainstream. Well, it did a bit. The other response was to make the connections to something larger, evoking the structural and the political, by claiming these were protests that were expressions of legitimate concerns of the white working class left behind ordinary people, or as BBC said, they were pro-British, which puts critics in a really awkward position because it puts them in the anti-British. And when I do interviews as a sort of with my accent, being anti-British means something else, and I have to defend my right to be there as opposed to being an expert, which I don't make a distinction between, but I don't think they can. Now we're seeing the same following the murder and the release of the body cam of Henry Novak. While the responses to the riots appear contradictory, it's exceptional individual. I don't believe one undermines the other. They serve the same purpose, the maintenance of the racial, social, economic status quo. The far right serves this function historically when it appears because it can be treated as both an outlier, representative of all society's racism, while the system can deny that racism, that injustice, and an expression of the people's legitimate concerns that must be represented and protected in ways that the system doesn't have to recognize or change its own racism and inequality. It's a barrier to, in the same way that unconscious bias training gets us all to admit we're biased, and then we don't have to deal with structural systemic inequalities. It's always great also when a manager requires that of you, the manager who's never experienced racism, and tells you that you're biased about things like race, immigration, gender, sexuality, ableism. This is the function of the far right. The far right is always representative of the systemic injustices and inequalities in society and polices them as if they're being undone. And it can do a lot of the work for that system. It's why you find, as I will talk to, you find counter-extremism and counterterrorism really fumbling over itself to try to police it. Now, the riots surprised some, not many people who were watching or experiencing this, due to a history that goes back a long, long time, including Thatcher's appropriation and co-option and parroting of National Front discourses, but also through austerity in 2008 to 10, post-10, and the emergence of the hostile environment in the UK. Ongoing culture war, Brexit, an election which saw reform enter the game, as well as wins for the far right globally, including Trump's re-election and Tommy Robinson's return to X. These were all factors. But the largest factor is the continued pandering to the far right and treating it as if it's a threat and a Democratic constituency at the exact same time. Now, I wanted to go over two main points. I mean, my analysis is larger, and I'm going to skip over some things that people will obviously think are important to sort of kind of schematize it, to say why I think it's important to look at the way in which we analyze, treat, and respond to the far right as part and parcel of its emergence, its mainstreaming, and its emboldening. So the first is the exceptionalization of racism. And this is the idea that extremism is a proxy for racism in our liberal democratic societies. And you'll hear this not just in people making a straight claim and not acknowledging anything else, but if you talk about microaggressions or you talk about systemic racism, people will say, yeah, but it's not as if it's not as if it's segregation or lynching. And you see a lot of those discussions in the media. You're like, and we see a lot of this right now around the issue of Palestine, where you go, well, it's not the Holocaust, or this is not something so seen as and constructed as so exceptional in world history that it can't be lived up to. So anyone's concerns, complaints, rights don't matter. So it's what Aurelian Mondon and I refer to as liberal versus illiberal racism. And it's basically those articulations of racism distinguish themselves as not being as bad as the things liberal societies have destroyed or defeated: slavery, segregation, apartheid, biological racism, genocide, fascism, colonialism, things which suspiciously are still going on. And in the case of colonialism, I always take that out when I'm giving a talk in Britain, because colonialism is not seen as defeated fairly. It's still actually celebrated. And then I go, well, you're Canadian, it was good, right? The concept of liberal racism, again, refers to those things that have been, that are not the defeated forms. They're the more coded, subtle, systemic forms of racism and other forms of targeted inequalities that are seen as to pale in comparison to the extremes. And there you end up with a situation where you've got Hitler, a random white supremacist, and that's the problem of racism. Problems that most people who are racialized will never encounter. Increasingly encountering the latter today, but not as damaging to health, quality of life, and other things such as education, healthcare, policing. Disparities in these areas are far more actually symbolically and really violent than an individual actor. And I'm not trying to dismiss the threat of the far right, but I'm trying to articulate that the far right serves a function where it can distract from those and then actually reinforce them, is what we're seeing. Now, the exceptionalization of the far right is often balanced out with the exceptionalization of our liberal societies, where we couldn't have this because we defeated apartheid, the Nazis. Now, you don't talk about how these countries may have supported the Nazis, not let in Jewish refugees, or actually called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. That's gone in historical memory. It's why I love when you talk to prevent officers and you work with some anti-racist organizations. They go, "We're taking these people to Auschwitz to see what racism can really do." Like, you should just hang around, just look at British history. You could, I mean, there's things you can learn. Talk to someone who's experienced these things. Now, it also sees liberal democracies as a bulwark against it, but some societies construct themselves as an exception. And I would argue Canada, the place of my birth, Scotland, the place of my children's birth, and Ireland, that because they've got neighbors that have gone far worse, far more rapidly, they may think they're safe and get into a context of complacency. So I want to show this. It's my favorite slide of all time. So you say, like, the far right is on social media. The far right is spewing bile from a Klan hood. This is my favorite slide of all time as a Canadian. This is where racism in the US is so bad, Canadians have to close the border to foreigners to keep their racism out. Now, we actually see something similar here. We see this with the construction of migrants, and particularly Muslims, as illiberal threats to liberalism. Liberal threats that justify illiberal, authoritarian, increasingly fascist policies to securitize, to keep them out. These are the same counter-extremism and counterterrorism tools that are also used to repress the democratic right to protest and the far right, ironically. So using institutionally racist policies and practices that are designed to deal with extremism and terrorism in racialized ways, also fighting the racism, not acknowledging that the far right and the mainstream all target the exact same groups. They share the same interests, the same patriotic identities and identifications. One interesting sort of paradox, right, or argument, right, that we have about liberal racism is Hillary Clinton's quote. I'm going to use this because it came after Brexit. "Europe must curb immigration to stop right-wing populists," which makes me think that she might not basically, I can't figure out what she does not like about these right-wing populists. Because it seems that their racism and xenophobia is okay. So what exactly is the threat? Well, the threat, the outlier, the way liberal racism works is to construct a form of liberal moderation that says, yeah, we're pushing the Overton window a bit, but it's better than those guys. And that's important because we see this going on with the discussion, with the debate around, or the conflict around immigration over can the Labour, the Tories versus Reform versus Restore. Who's more racist? Who ends up on the right side of the worst forms of racism? That's where our future lies. That's a really cynical and really dangerous area to get into. You have Keir Starmer echoing Enoch Powell. You have Matthew Goodwin running in Gorton and Denton for Reform, basically claiming that they are to the liberal side of Restore. Who's the further right party. Now, the other thing is that liberal racism, it doesn't just, it emboldens, it mainstreams far right ideas under the idea of keeping them out of government and keeping them off the streets. But it also targets Muslims in the exact same way the far right does, as illiberal threats to our great held liberal values around gender, sexuality, and free speech. And that actually the only way we can preserve these things is often through narratives in which the far right is allowed to claim to be defending the rights and lives and safety of white women and girls, or the way in which the far right aligns with more sort of LGBT organizations against trans men and women, or the way in which we say, well, we have to have a balanced media ecosystem, because if we don't allow the far right and racists on television and in the radio, then actually the right's going to get really angry and feel censored or canceled, because otherwise we know they don't. And then we have an example of cancellation. I think in this case, if I remember correctly, Tommy Robinson was brought in as an expert on terrorism. Now, what's interesting about that is in espousing the virtues of liberalism, what they've also done is they've created approaches to extremism and terrorism, which are not only repressive and authoritarian and always racialized, but they're often presented as equal. So we're liberally color and ideology blind counter-extremism and counterterrorism. We're going to get racism of all types. And we saw with Shawcross's independent review of Prevent, the moment the right had their hands on it, go, we can't really focus on the far right because you can't really tell the difference between their ideas and mainstream right-wing ones, which is kind of saying the quiet part loud. And then he said, let's focus on Islamism. And what's interesting about that also is that soon after, and this was in the wake of the election, October 7th, but also Galloway's win in Rochdale, George Galloway's win, there was a new extremism definition that focused on preserving Britain's values and culture. And anti-racist organizations and Muslim organizations immediately said, this is going to be disproportionately affect us. And then you have, no, couldn't happen, it's equal. And then the Michael Gove, whose community center is named, Mend, Cage, a number of other organizations which were Muslim, and claimed they were expressing Islamist ideas, echoing what Shawcross had said. Now, this puts us in a sort of a weird dilemma where if counter-extremism and counterterrorism can't work with these organizations and these actors, what can? Well, the other option seems to be their votes. And I think that goes back to my exceptionalization, democratization argument. That's just, I should just also note, the only organization that was prescribed after the far-right riots was Palestine Action, just to say. Now, it's not, to be fair to the government, they did prescribe two far-right ones. Do you think they were British? They were Ukrainian and Russian. Let's talk about, politically equal and color and ideology blind in a war that the government supports only one side. So being fair that way, right? And we have a template or a precedent for that. After Thomas Mayer murdered Joe Cox, the MP, just on the eve of Brexit, the government prescribed not a pro-Brexit, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim organization, but national action, like basically a paradigm for sort of like Nazi hate that could be prescribed, but not implicate anyone who could potentially vote, or the interest of anyone who could vote. And that takes me sort of to the final section, which is about voting effectively. And the second narrative, democratization, where the idea that the far right and racism are not only the preserve, but the preserve and expressions of white working class grievance. Now, for this, we have, this is the demand side argument that political scientists have. The people want racism. They want bordering. And what they don't do is critically reflect on the idea of supply, or whether the data produced in these kind of polls is accurate. And now the fact that a lot of the early work that still remains held by the media and politicians was done by Matthew Goodwin, who is running for reform and was consulting with UKIP and the Tories before, should kind of give the game away. Yeah. And I just want to argue that this democratization has basically legitimized the far right. It has pursued a white grievance or victimization narrative under the auspices of dealing with class inequality a class inequality that is not shared with racialized or minoritized people, but a white victim and grievance narrative that is shared by white people across the class system, including elites like Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, etc. But worse is it counts the class inequality and wider inequalities experienced by migratized and racialized people who are then treated as collateral damage. And their interests are not that they share with white working class people, save race, are not addressed. And it allows the maintenance of the status quo under the auspices of dealing with one form of inequality. And we see this again and again because it's effectively an ethnic competition reverse racism argument. And it's become a truism in politics. And it's created a situation where immigration is the only thing that matters and inequality suffered by white people is the only thing that matters. And those white people have to be right-wing and racist, because otherwise their inequalities don't matter either, because they're not marketing themselves to socialists. They're not marketing themselves to trade unionists here. It's an undermining of trade unionism and socialism, in fact. And I think that's just to end it. I think these are really important things that we need to be critical of and we need to watch. Now, I'm not saying that all of these things will occur or apply in Ireland, but some of these narratives are there. And one of the biggest lessons is to simultaneously challenge them before they become sedimented as they have. And the second one is to look for moments of hope. And I think it's really important because we have seen hope in the left, in the anti-racist, anti-fascist mobilizations, resistance, organizations and activists, community groups, NGOs, who do offer an alternative analysis, resistance, and hope. And some organizations like many of those represented here. But I think also in the fact that there has to be a political opposition. There has to be a political alternative for people to support. And even where we see this in the UK with the Greens, they're treated as if they're a threat to the system in a way the far right never could be, because the far right defends the racial, gender, social, and economic order. It's not a threat. It's a scapegoat and a reaffirmation exercise. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah.
Sorry, we're running a bit out of time, but we have about maybe 5 minutes or so for
Sorry about
questions.
that.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it was my fault.
I thought the 15 minutes came after. That was why. Sorry.
So if anybody, yes.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. I'm just going to find the exceptionalism. You were talking about these appeals to British values. We also hear all this stuff about European values. But it seems to me like all these politicians and journalists, the people who want to be the adults in the room where they describe themselves, do you actually think they believe any of these principles? Because it seems like they don't have any concept of them, which is why they very easily fall into the trap, whether it's freedom of expression or the separation of powers. Like, that's what seems to me to be quite shocking. The people who claim to care so much about liberal democracy don't appear to have any fundamental principles or don't seem to understand them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think I've got two answers for that. I mean, one is that the whole adults in the room thing is a very liberal centrist argument anyway. And it's always saying to people, I hate racism, I hate the extremism, but it's also coming from the other side. So let's be civil. And who has to be civil are largely people who are the most kind of affected by these forms of hate and inequalities and injustice. I think the other issue is, this is not directed to you, I don't care if they believe it. And one of the reasons I don't care is because if you're willing to sort of platform racism and transphobia and sexism and homophobia, like, then you are. If not, you're just a sort of like a proxy for that system or a sort of like a marketing kind of director for that system. Not even a director, but and Andy Burnham, like I was really saying, like Andy Burnham, like showed what labor can be, limited, still centrist, still liberal, but like not far right enabling and pandering. And what does he do immediately with the Macclesfield election? He starts going, yeah, I don't believe in non-gendered bathrooms, and I think immigration can be an issue, and austerity is not too bad, and it's not a genocide which is occurring. And it's like, well, of course he's doing that. Of course he's doing that. And the thing is that these are calculations people make. And I'm sorry, but I don't think a large amount of the world should be collateral damage for like a cynical calculation. And if you're willing to, you're doing worse than just being cynical. you're dehumanizing people.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
Thanks so much for this. Oh, okay. Yeah, so my question is about kind of trying to get towards the vein of emancipatory politics. In all of this really important and careful and detailed work that you do to break open these discourses and show sort of what's going on within these big talking points, do you also see new possibilities for kind of unlikely political alliances towards emancipatory politics? Or like, what do we get after we sort of break open this field the way that you're doing in your work towards actually sort of building coalitions in ways that liberalism maybe makes seem unlikely or impossible in the way that it kind of takes over the field of discourse about race and you know, the future of a better world or whatever. Does that make sense?
It makes a
Yeah.
great question. And I mean, to be honest with you, I had a plan, but Barry stopped me. No, so yeah, I do. I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is that while I'm trying to break it open, I'm also trying to articulate the way in which, and I couldn't do all of this today, the way in which the system co-ops and consolidates power, appropriating and dividing emancipatory movements. And I think that's something we have to be very, very attentive to. And that's not an argument of going like, we need a materialist analysis, not an identity one. I'm all for identity. Like that's, because I don't think these are separable. But I think that and a lot of my work focuses on the divide and rule and the repression of potentially successful or powerful or effective movements. I think that, and we're doing a session on this weekend with Migrant Rights Network about effective responses to the far right. And one of the discussion points is like, what do older movements have to say? What do new ones? How do we construct an intersectional approach? And I don't have an actual answer for that, but I do know that there's things sometimes we do that allow the right to kind of unpack us. And I wouldn't say it's our fault, but the fact is that divide and rule over certain issues become manifest. But also there's these weird generation things that are occurring. Like as someone who's, I was gonna say I'm middle-aged, I'm older, getting older than that, but I don't want to be damning the kids and social media for becoming radicalized right or left and say, well, there's a way of doing it that it's like, here's Das Kapital, like these kind of things. But like, I think we have to watch traps and we have to listen to young people. We have to listen to previous generations, but we can't be in a sort of authoritative position. But I also think that, my argument would be that I don't like division and I don't like orthodoxy. I think the idea that, it has to be absolutely radically inclusive and no one's rights or can be sacrificed. So I'm finding a lot of spaces where I'm going like, yeah, but like, you have to admit, the trans issue is a distraction from, and I don't see people's rights and dignity or survival as kind of a sort of a distraction. I disagree with the idea that racism is a distraction, despite who said it. But the idea is that it has to be sort of radically inclusive. It has to be democratic, but it also has to be faster than it is. But I think we also have to challenge things and demand better of the politicians. I would just do one anecdote. Labor came to my door during a previous election, knocked on my door, and they're like, you're a Labor member. I'm like, well, not anymore. And it's like, well, and I said, I wouldn't vote for a party that is against migration and that mainstreams the far right and stuff like this. And he told me that I don't understand the far right and that if I vote Green, I'm going to be causing the mainstreaming of the far right. Now, I'm not so arrogant to go, I've got a book for you. But so I actually said, you know what, I'm a migrant, get off my property. Right? And the thing is that I don't think there can be compromise. And I think I'm not an accelerationist. I think there's going to be some bad times. And I often think of the sort of the radical people, colleagues of mine will give this apocalyptic scenario and they go, But hope, I'm not like that. I often like Bob Dylan's kind of thing at the end, good luck. But I think there has to be more than that. There has to be something in between good luck, pessimism, or apocalypticism, good luck, and hope in a sort of an abstract way without the strategies and the commitment.
Well, one more question, then we'll go for a break. Anybody else? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, just a quick question. So I'm involved with for many people in this room in many occasions encountering far right marches that have taken place in Dublin. Now, just to be clear, when I say far right, I mean marches organised by recognised far right individuals. Some of these marches, down O'Connell Street, have maybe had 10,000 people in them. The majority of whom maybe are not particularly ideological, or people who are frustrated and alienated and all of that stuff. And we've been in situations maybe with different, maybe 100, 200 of us, and 10,000 people, most of whom are shouting abuse, and a line of police kind of stopping us from having our throats slit, essentially, in some of these situations, and it can be pretty demoralizing. But the one thing that has sort of given me hope is that on alternative weeks, we'd have a march for Palestine where we'd have 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people, and it's maybe it's not a complete direct divide between sort of racism and anti-racism, but the Palestine marches would have hugely diverse crowd, and I suspect most of the people on them would be extremely sympathetic with, say, our positions on immigration and all of those things. And I just wonder, could you say something about that, about this movement for Palestine and the role that has played in this? Because it's been the one thing that's given me hope, in the sense that we can get large numbers of people on the streets who I think have an anti-imperialist, anti-racist and so on position, because it doesn't seem like that sometimes when we're trying to directly counter far-right mobilizations.
Yeah, no, great question, great example. And I'm currently doing revisions on an article about exactly that question, about the far right and Palestinian marches. And the way they're both policed and show radical, sort of futures. I think you're right, but I also think it's very telling how quick those marches in other places, and I'm not going to speak to the Irish context because I'm not familiar enough with it, have been labeled extremist, anti-Semitic. I have to say, I've worked on white supremacy for like 25 years. I've never received as many death threats and attacks as I have from taking my kids to a march and posting about it like an idiot. But yeah, no, I think these are diverse. They are anti-colonial. Maybe there's some bad actors, but I don't really care. And I don't really care, not because I think bad actors can be dismissed, but because I think that's become the whole story that takes away. And then when you see the far right ones, they make the far bad actor idea and represent these as all families who just are looking after their kids and just all this. And I often think, well, of course it's families. They've been told everyone's a groomer and there's a population replacement, conspiracy going on. Of course they're bringing kids. But that I do think these do show hope and the future. And I think that's why they're being cracked down on so seriously. And I would say, and I'd like to hear more about the Irish context. In Britain, it's been pretty bad, but it's been nowhere as bad as like in Germany and in the US. It's absolutely shocking. And I think it's because of the hope. And actually, after the riots, the Metropolitan Police said, we didn't see this coming because we were too busy focused on Just Stop Oil and the National March for Palestine. And what happens after that wake-up call? They start focusing on those again, and then prescribe Palestine action and ignore everything else. So I think that the fact is, and I'm not usually inclined towards this theory, but that kind of power, that hope, that democratic articulation and expression is why it has to be repressed, particularly if all politics is being done from the right.
Yeah.
It's not hopeful, I'm sorry, but
Okay, we'll have to leave it at that. I'm sorry.